All right, so you wanted to get into this whole government funding fight, right? And figure out what it says about the Republican Party these days. Well, you sent over a ton of articles on this, and let me tell you, this thing went from like zero to total chaos super fast.
Yeah, it's kind of wild how something that's usually just routine, like
Uh-huh.
passing a stopgap spending bill, turned into a total showdown.
Yeah.
It really exposed some serious rifts within the Republican Party,
Yeah.
and it left a lot of people wondering if they can even govern at all, effectively.
Right. Yeah. It initially seemed like there was this like clear bipartisan agreement to keep the government running and everything. I mean, they even agreed on things like disaster relief, farm subsidies, and funding for childhood cancer research. There was even stuff in there about restricting investments in China and banning revenge porn and deepfake pornography.
You're right. At first glance, it did seem like a well-oiled machine of compromise, just the way it should be. But then the cracks started to show when some hard-right Republicans, specifically members of the Freedom Caucus, started voicing some strong opposition. This group is known for their strict interpretation of the Constitution and their commitment to limited government. So they wield a significant amount of power within the Republican Party.
Okay, so we've got this group pushing back, but then things get even weirder when Elon Musk enters the picture. Did anyone see this coming? Like a billionaire with a social media empire suddenly becoming a key player in government funding negotiations. I sure didn't.
Yeah, it was a strange turn of events for sure. Musk, who's a known ally of former President Trump, he used his platform X to
Yeah.
openly bash the bill. He even spread claims about it financing bioweapons labs, which were
Uh,
quickly debunked.
yeah, seeing those tweets go viral, it felt like watching a political drama unfold in real time. Except this wasn't some TV show. This was the actual government on the line. And then to make matters worse, Trump himself jumped on board, repeating Musk's criticisms and adding his own demands like tying a debt ceiling increase to the bill.
This is where it gets really fascinating. We're seeing this emergence of a new kind of power dynamic in our political system, where individuals with massive platforms and wealth like Musk, they can exert a huge influence. The fact that his opinions, which are often based on misinformation, could potentially derail crucial legislation. That's a pretty worrisome trend.
It's definitely uncharted territory. Makes you wonder if we're heading towards a system where billionaire opinions carry more weight than the voices of the people we actually elected. And speaking of elected officials, let's talk about House Speaker Mike Johnson. He found himself caught in the middle of all this chaos, trying to manage a group of Republicans with very strong and often conflicting opinions.
Yeah. Johnson's position was already shaky to begin with. He barely secured the speakership after a record number of voting rounds, which was a clear sign of the divisions within his own party. And this fight over the stopgap bill only made things worse, especially with the Freedom Caucus constantly challenging his leadership and pushing back against any kind of compromise.
So what were the Freedom Caucus's specific concerns?
Well, they were deeply opposed to raising the debt ceiling, which has been a long-standing point of contention. For fiscal conservatives who view it as reckless spending, they saw any attempt to raise the debt ceiling as a betrayal of their core values, and they refused to budge on this issue. This created even deeper divisions within the Republican Party and put Johnson in an incredibly difficult position.
So he had to find a way to keep the government funded without alienating either side of his party. It sounds like a political tightrope walk.
Exactly. With a potential government shutdown looming, the pressure was immense. In the end, Johnson managed to push through a compromise bill, but it came at a cost. The debt ceiling increase was removed, but a backroom deal was struck for future budget cuts. This appeased the Freedom Caucus in the short term, but it exposed the fragility of Johnson's leadership, and it highlighted the growing power of this faction within the Republican Party.
So a temporary Band-Aid was slapped on a much deeper wound.
That's a good way to put it.
Hmm.
We often see this pattern in politics where short-term solutions are prioritized, kicking the can down the road, and potentially creating even bigger problems down the line. This whole episode raises some serious concerns about the GOP's ability to effectively govern, especially with a razor-thin majority in the next Congress.
Okay, so we've got this internal power struggle playing out
Right.
within the Republican Party. But let's go back to Musk and Trump for a second. Is this the beginning of a new political power duo?
While it might not be a formal partnership, their combined influence is undeniably powerful. Musk, with his platform and wealth, he can significantly amplify Trump's message and rally his dedicated online followers. In return, Trump provides Musk with a degree of political capital and access to a wider base of supporters.
This whole situation really puts a spotlight on the growing role of social media in our political landscape, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We're seeing how platforms like X can be used to spread misinformation, shape public opinion, and even pressure elected officials. The speed at which these messages spread and gain traction is unprecedented and raises serious questions about the future of our democracy.
It's almost like we're watching a high-stakes political game play out online, with the potential for real-world consequences.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And it brings up a crucial question. What does it mean for our democracy when unelected individuals with massive platforms can exert this level of influence? This incident, though centered on a routine spending bill, has opened up a Pandora's box of questions about who really holds the power in our political system.
This is heavy stuff. We need a minute to process all this. But before we do, I want to point out one thing that jumped out at me from these articles: the internal chaos within the Republican Party. This fight over the stopgap bill. It feels like a preview of even bigger battles to come.
You're absolutely right. This wasn't just a one-off event. It revealed deep-seated divisions within the GOP that are likely to intensify in the next Congress, the upcoming swearing in of the new Congress, the potential challenge to Johnson's speakership, and the looming debt ceiling fight in the spring. All of these point towards a turbulent period ahead for the Republican Party.
And don't forget the other hot-button issues they'll have to tackle, like immigration, taxes, support for Ukraine, and abortion. This is a recipe for gridlock, and potentially even more internal conflict.
The GOP's ability to effectively govern in this environment will be put to the test. They campaigned on a platform of fiscal responsibility and government efficiency, yet their actions seem to be producing the opposite.
It seems like they're struggling to reconcile their ideological commitments with the practical realities of governing.
That's the core issue. This contradiction could have serious consequences, not just for the party itself, but for the country as a whole.
All right, before we get into what all this means for you and the average American, let's take a quick pause to gather our thoughts. When we come back, we'll dive into the potential fallout of this political drama and explore how it could impact your daily life. Stick with us.
Welcome back. So before we took a moment to reflect, we were talking about the potential for a major showdown over the debt ceiling in the spring.
Yeah, and to be honest, sometimes these political battles feel like they're happening in a different universe. Can you help us understand why this debt ceiling issue should matter to regular people like us?
Absolutely. It's easy to kind of tune out when things seem abstract, but this is far from theoretical. The outcome of this fight could directly impact your finances, your job, even access to essential services.
Okay, so let's get specific. How could this potentially affect me?
Well, imagine a scenario where the U.S. defaults on its debt. That's exactly what's at stake if the debt ceiling isn't raised. This could trigger a global financial meltdown. Think stock market crashes, interest rates skyrocketing, and a credit crunch that makes getting a loan next to impossible. Businesses would struggle, jobs would disappear, and retirement savings could take a huge hit.
That paints a pretty grim picture.
And it doesn't stop there. Essential government services could be disrupted. Imagine Social Security checks being delayed, Medicare reimbursements stalling, funding for critical programs being cut off. Things most people rely on for basic security and well-being would be thrown into jeopardy.
So it's like this political fight could create a ripple effect that touches every aspect of our lives.
Exactly. It's a reminder that what happens in Washington doesn't stay confined to Washington. These decisions have real-world consequences for all of us, which is why it's so important to pay attention and hold our elected officials accountable for making responsible choices.
You know, going back to the articles you sent, I keep thinking about the role Elon Musk played in this whole saga. It's mind-boggling that a single billionaire can have such a huge impact on something as crucial as government funding.
It definitely raises questions about the concentration of wealth and how it translates into political power. In this case, Musk used his platform and resources to amplify a particular viewpoint, which ultimately swayed the negotiations.
It makes you wonder, are we truly living in a democracy? When unelected billionaires can wield this kind of influence?
That's a debate that's gaining momentum. The rise of figures like Musk highlights concerns about accountability and transparency in our political system. Unlike elected officials, these billionaires aren't directly answerable to voters. There's no real mechanism to check their power or hold them accountable for their actions.
It's a dangerous situation, especially if they're using their influence to push an agenda that might not be in the best interests of the general public. What can we as everyday citizens even do about it? Does our voice even matter in the face of such massive wealth and influence?
Never underestimate the power of individual action and collective engagement, staying informed, engaging in critical thinking, and holding those in power accountable. Those are crucial first steps. You can support organizations that advocate for campaign finance reform and contact your elected officials to voice your concerns about the undue influence of wealth in politics.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but I see your point. We can't just sit back and let this happen. We have to speak up and demand change.
Exactly. Democracy thrives on active participation, not passive observation.
Okay, we've talked about the debt ceiling showdown, the outsized influence of billionaires, and the challenges the GOP is facing. But let's zoom out for a moment. What does all of this tell us about the bigger picture of American politics today?
Well, I think it reflects a worrying trend of increasing political polarization. It's getting harder and harder to govern effectively in such a divided landscape.
Yeah, it does feel like everyone is retreating to their own corners, leaving very little room for common ground.
You're right. Compromise has become almost taboo, and the focus has shifted from finding solutions to scoring political points.
And social media seems to be amplifying these divisions. It's creating echo chambers, where people only encounter information that reinforces their existing beliefs.
That's one of the downsides of the digital age. Social media, while potentially valuable for communication and information sharing, can also breed misinformation, outrage, and hostility.
It's a vicious cycle. The more polarized we become, the harder it is to have productive conversations and find common ground. This makes it even easier for extreme viewpoints to gain traction.
You've hit on a crucial point. We need to find ways to break out of these echo chambers and engage in meaningful dialogue with people who hold different perspectives.
That sounds great in theory, but it's easier said than done, isn't it?
It's definitely not easy, but it's essential. We have to be willing to listen to each other, understand different viewpoints, and find common ground. If we don't, we risk further dividing our society and undermining the very foundations of our democracy.
So how do we bridge these divides and start having more productive conversations about politics? Honestly, it feels like anytime I bring up politics with certain friends or family members, it ends in an argument.
I understand that feeling. Avoiding these conversations altogether isn't the answer, though.
What?
We need to find ways to engage in respectful dialogue, even when we disagree.
I'm all for respectful dialogue, but how do we actually make that happen? What are some practical tips?
Start by actively listening to the other person's perspective, even if you don't agree with it. Ask clarifying questions to make sure you understand their point of view. And try to find common ground, even if it's just a shared concern or value.
That makes sense. But what about when people are spreading misinformation or conspiracy theories? How do you have a productive conversation with someone who's not even grounded in reality?
That's a tough one. In those situations, it's important to stay calm, stick to the facts, and avoid getting pulled into emotional arguments.
It's easier said than done, especially when you're talking to someone who's absolutely convinced that the Earth is flat or something.
I agree. It can be incredibly challenging. It's important to remember that people are often resistant to changing their beliefs, even when presented with evidence to the contrary.
So is there even any point in trying?
Absolutely. Even if you don't change the other person's mind, you might plant a seed of doubt or encourage them to think more critically about the information they're consuming. Sometimes that's the best we can hope for.
It's interesting how we started this deep dive talking about a government funding battle. And now we're having this meta conversation about the very nature of democracy and the challenges of political discourse.
It's all connected, the way we talk about politics, the information we consume, and how we interact with each other. It shapes the political landscape and determines the kind of society we create.
You've definitely given us a lot to think about. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the most important message is this. Don't be a passive observer. Engage in the political process. Stay informed, think critically, and have those tough conversations. The future of our democracy depends on it.
Well said. Before we move on to our final thoughts, we want to give everyone a chance to absorb everything we've discussed. When we return, we'll leave you with some final points to ponder as you continue to explore the world of politics. And we're back for our final thoughts on this whole government funding saga and what it all means for the Republican Party.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From Elon Musk's surprising influence to the looming debt ceiling crisis. This situation has really revealed a lot about the state of our political system.
You know, one thing that's been on my mind is just how fragile everything feels right now.
That's a good observation. I mean, this whole situation has exposed vulnerabilities, not just within the Republican Party, but in our broader political landscape as well.
Can you talk about that a bit more? Like, what specifically makes you say that?
Well, we've seen how a relatively small group of dissident Republicans can effectively hold the entire government hostage. We've seen the outsized influence of figures like Elon Musk, who are unelected, yet wield significant power. And we've talked about this growing problem of political polarization and the erosion of trust in our institutions.
Yeah, it's not exactly a rosy picture.
It's definitely a challenging moment for American democracy. However, challenges often present unique opportunities for growth and change.
Interesting. What kind of opportunities are you thinking about?
Well, this period of crisis could serve as a wake-up call, prompting a national conversation about the health of our democracy and the reforms that are necessary to strengthen it.
I like where you're going with this. What kind of reforms would address these vulnerabilities?
Well, there are many possibilities. Campaign finance reform to limit the influence of money in politics, strengthening ethical guidelines for elected officials to ensure accountability, promoting media literacy to help people navigate the sea of misinformation out there, and fostering a culture of civil discourse where people can engage in respectful debate even when they disagree. These are just a few ideas to start with.
These all sound like great ideas in theory, but how do we actually make them happen? Our political system seems so resistant to change.
You're right, it won't be easy. It'll require consistent effort from citizens, activists, and policymakers alike.
Yeah.
But I believe it's possible. We've faced numerous challenges throughout our history and emerged stronger on the other side. This is no different.
Okay, I'm trying to stay optimistic, but it can feel a little overwhelming. Where do we even begin to tackle such big issues?
Start by focusing on what you can control. Stay informed. Engage in critical thinking. Talk about these issues with your friends and family, and support organizations working towards these goals. Even small actions contribute to larger movements for change.
It's a good reminder that we're not powerless.
Exactly. Hope is not passive. It's an active choice. It's a commitment to keep working towards a better future, even when things feel difficult.
Well said. As we conclude this deep dive into the state of the Republican Party, we want to leave you with one final thought. What role will you play in shaping the future of our democracy? Will you be a passive observer or an active participant? The choice is yours.
We hope this exploration has given you a deeper understanding of our government and the forces shaping its future. Keep those questions in mind as you engage with the news and form your own opinions, because as we've seen, the story is far from over.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another insightful look at the issues that matter most. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.